Many millennia ago, the Legion of Astartes fractured. Brother turned against brother, legion against legion, and the greatest civil war in Imperial history, the Horus Heresy, began. Many legions were split internally, just as the Astartes broadly divided along legionary lines. But whilst most of the traitors from the loyalist legions have passed into myth and memory, one group persists. They were the rebels of the original legion, led by the nearest thing to a father or brother their Primarch had before his rediscovery. They remain a black mark on the legion and all its successors, and the entire modus operandi of those who remained loyal was changed by their deeds. And yet, some would argue that they were never traitors at all, at least not to the Emperor or to the Imperium at least. Formerly led by Luther, and perhaps now re-led by Luther, or maybe led if anyone by Marvis or Cypher, they are known as the Fallen Angels. This is Tactica Imperialis, and welcome to 40k Stories. To understand the origins of the Fallen Angels, first you need to know the tale of Luther. I've told this story before long ago during my Legions logs, but this should serve as a refresher. Luther was the individual who found Lionel Johnson, the Primarch of the First Legion of Astartes, when he arrived on Caliban after the scattering of the Primarchs from Terra. He somewhat adopted the young Primarch and raised him, and the pair became fast friends as well as champions among the feudal knights of Caliban. However, Lion eventually surpassed Luther within the ranks of the Order, as the knights were known, and whilst it did nothing at the time, it is said to have planted a seed that would only flourish over the intervening years. When the Emperor and his great crusade reached Caliban, Lion was recognised as a Primarch and given command of the First Legion, given their new name the Dark Angels, in part due to an almost offhand comment made by Luther himself. As an adult, Luther would normally not have been eligible to join the ranks of the Astartes even after their relocation to and recruitment from Caliban, but in honour of his bond with the Lion, a special exception was made. Much like Corpheron of the Wordbearers Legion, Luther was augmented to near the level of a Space Marine through a mixture of things, and whilst he wasn't as large as his new Astartes brothers, he was still one of them in all the ways that mattered. He was made second in command of the Dark Angels behind Lion, and whilst they remained fast friends throughout much of the following Great Crusade, there was something that niggled at Luther. Nothing he could place, but something nonetheless. This all came to a head during an attempted assassination of the Lion by the Xenos of the planet-coded 4-3, better known as Sarosh. A bomb was left on Lion's ship with the intent to kill the Primarch, and Luther was the one to discover the device. He disarmed it with a little help, but for a moment he considered not doing so, encouraged by that seed planted on Caliban that had blossomed into what you might recognise as jealousy. Unfortunately, Lion caught wind of what had happened, and he was not impressed in the slightest. The two fought, and Luther was sent back to Caliban along with the forces under his command to oversee recruitment, though he and presumably others saw it instead as a banishment from the Great Crusade. But Luther did comply, somewhat, leaving the Dark Angels' crusading forces to head for home, but he didn't stay there, working with the forces of Horus Lupercal, much to Lion's annoyance. Combine this with the rebellions on Caliban due to the re-emergence of their warp beast problem, and things began to spiral out of control for Luther. He came to believe that, should the Imperium become aware of the planet's corruption, Caliban was at risk of being destroyed by said Imperium. On top of that, he believed that Lion was in fact aware of all of this and had sent Luther back as a death sentence for when that almost inevitable exterminatus came calling. These beliefs spread to those who followed and served under Luther, and things finally came to a head when, at least in secret, they seceded from the Imperium and turned many of the Dark Angels on the world to their side. Now, at this point, you could argue that the motivations were at least somewhat noble, but things degenerated from there following an attempted but ultimately defeated ritual by Terran Chaos cultists. Luther and the Fallen studied the warp, with Luther himself developing an ability to nullify incoming psychic attacks, and the tensions between the pro- and anti-Imperial groups on Caliban only continued to escalate. However, and excuse me if I confuse things a little by saying this, the Fallen to be were not technically anti-imperial, or at least not all of them were. When the knight-errant Garviel Loken and agent of Malcador Iacton Cruz arrived on Caliban, their mission was to determine the loyalty of both Luther and Caliban as well as the Lion. Through the aid of a Watcher in the Dark, a diminutive entity that was native to Caliban and remains with the Loyalist Archangels to this day, Loken was able to read Luther's mind and see that his loyalties lay with the side opposed to Lionel Johnson, whose loyalty was, at the time, unknown. Even when a loyalist chapter master of the First Legion came seeking reinforcement during the heresy, Luther did not wish him to be killed, but was forced to aid a purge of said chapter master's forces after fellow Fallen did have him assassinated. It was around this time that one could say that Luther chose his side, even if some of the Fallen had already done so. He met with and welcomed forces led by the traitor Callus Typhon of the Death Guard, and by the end of the heresy, one could argue that he was no longer himself, corrupted by chaos. But remember, had Lion decided to follow Horus into betraying the Imperium, Luther would have been at least neutral, if not a loyalist in the heresy. That's not to say all of the Fallen would have stayed with him, but it is worth noting. That, of course, didn't happen, but the tale of Luther and co. goes somewhat quiet for a while at this point, until the Horus Heresy was over. The First Legion had arrived late to Terra for the siege of the Imperial Palace, having devoted time along with the Ultramarines to allow the Blood Angels to arrive on time, though some to this day claim that Lion wanted to wait and see and was stalling rather than anything else. I don't know if I believe it, but the Fallen would certainly tell you that sort of thing. They left the cradle of humanity soon after, well, once Lion and Leman Russ had buried the hatchet, with the plan to return to Caliban and reinforce. They'd been away for a while. However, they never got the chance due to the actions of the Fallen, who began attacking the Loyalist fleet with the planet's surface defences. Johnson quickly discovered that Luther was the one responsible, at least on the macro scale, and so the Dark Angels invaded their own homeworld to root out the corrupting influence of chaos that they believed had to be at work to cause this fall. They were wrong as to the why, at least initially, but given what they'd just been through in the heresy, it does make sense. The majority of the battle itself has been lost to the ages, save for two key details and events: the destruction of Caliban itself and the duel between Primarch and Fallen Champion. The latter of these was actually much less one-sided than the nature of the combatants would have you believe, as just like Horus when he fought the Emperor, Luther had been powered up by the Chaos Gods to bring him up to Johnson's level. And again, in more parallels with the duel aboard the Vengeful Spirit just a short time before, the anti-Imperial took the upper hand. It was close, but Luther was able to land a mortal blow against his former pupil with the aid of psychic powers. And in yet another parallel, this would prove the downfall of the Chaos God's champion, as Luther realised what he'd just done, and despite his seeming previous hatred of Johnson, he couldn't land the killing blow, and eventually gave up. What happened next is intrinsically tied to Caliban's destruction and the subsequent creation of the Rock, which became the fortress monastery of the Dark Angels going forward, but the details vary depending on which version of events you might have heard. For a long time, the commonly accepted narrative was that the Chaos Gods became enraged at Luther's failure and summoned a titanic warp storm, spiriting away much of the Fallen and destroying the planet that had already been cracked by the Loyalist bombardments. However, it is possible that the fall of Caliban and the dispersal of the Fallen was the result of something a little less overtly malicious, at least if you see the Chaos Gods as malicious anyway. In M41, yes, I know, stay with me, the Dark Angels of the modern era clashed with the Fallen and the Death Guard, who were attempting to use the Tactica engine to bring the Fallen of M31 into the present day. They were thwarted by Supreme Grandmaster Azrael, who ordered the engine to scatter all individuals near to the portal the traitor forces had created. However, the temporal link had already been established, and this caused the Fallen of the past to be scattered as well. Oops. So that's how the Fallen Angels came to be, and due to the Chaos Gods or the Tactica engine, we can also understand why they were able to survive having almost their entire strength besieged by the victorious Loyalist Dark Angels. However, the Fallen represent something a little more significant to the former First Legion than just an incidental black mark on their record. Almost every Legion has those. To the Loyalist Dark Angels, the Fallen are a hidden yet immense shame, and the collection of the Dark Angels and their successor chapters are known as the Unforgiven solely because of the Fallen's existence. The moniker will exist probably until all of the Fallen have been killed or at least made to repent for their actions in choosing to follow Luther. Though those who repent are usually slain afterwards anyway, death is unavoidable, but the length and method varies by willingness to repent. That said, the Fallen Angels are not a cohesive group by any stretch of the imagination. Certainly they haven't been until recently, and the motivations and actions of its members has varied greatly in the millennia since their scattering. The typical assumption, certainly the one made by the Dark Angels themselves, is that the Fallen are traitors to this day and usually in the thrall of chaos. It can take the form of hiding in plain sight as an agent or even as a governor, or it will be a little less brazen, with a change of name and a hiding of former allegiance, though some will have been obnoxiously loud about their history too. This is all true for a good number of Fallen, with some even ascending to demonhood at some point or another, but whilst you do see Fallen hiding in Chaos Space Marine warbands, or even forming warbands of their own, it's not true for everyone, unless you're a Psyker. That seems to have a 100% corruption rate that we've seen. There are many Fallen who hold slightly different views on theirs and Caliban's fall. Some may feel genuine regret or remorse for their decisions, seeking to find their own form of redemption whilst knowing they cannot operate publicly. Others are far less repentant, maintaining as many said back in the day that Lion was the traitor and that Luther was the loyalist, and thus they're still loyalist. Whether there's any fragment of truth in that is not a matter for this log, you can make up your own mind, but those Fallen with that mindset are absolutely set on it as an idea. This stance is one that drops the Fallen into a box one could broadly describe as renegade Astartes as opposed to traitors if true. Sometimes still loyal to the Imperium, but absolutely not in the service of chaos, working in the shadows for theirs or humanity's goals as agents or mercenaries. It's almost always a lonely way of living, since avoiding the Dark Angels probably means trusting absolutely no one and maintaining strict silence and anonymity, but it's worked for many of them for a fair old time. That said, the silence benefits the Dark Angels too, as well as the Fallen in some ways, as the greatest weapon the Fallen have over their former brothers is the fact that they exist, honestly. The Dark Angels want the Fallen wiped from the galaxy, and potentially from history as well, so it leaves the Fallen who want to screw over the Dark Angels with an interesting option to open their mouths and start talking. Whether they're dismissed as raving madmen or bought into en masse, spreading the story of the Fallen Angels and the fall of Caliban via Fallen themselves would be a nightmare for the Dark Angels, as whispers can spread like wildfire and warp opinions over a vast region whilst proving near impossible to contain. Unfortunately for the Fallen, speaking up will almost inevitably also set into motion a chain of events that will bring the Dark Angels down on their heads eventually. And if they're still loyal to the Imperium, then the thought of the retribution of the Angels, likely causing mass murder and destruction in the name of containment, would be a horrifying one. And the Chaos-aligned ones, well, they value their lives a little too highly to just go running their mouth, keeping the millennia-old game of cat and mouse going as the hunt for the Fallen goes on. And perhaps most ironically of all, the Dark Angels don't even know they're hunting for the Fallen the vast majority of the time. Only the inner circle, broadly the First Company and command elements of the Unforgiven, are told the story of Luther at even a surface level. The Raven Wing, the elite Second Company typically responsible for prosecuting the damn hunts, aren't really aware of what's going on for the most part. That's just how paranoid the Dark Angels are about their own history. So really, it's a game of cat and mouse, where the cat doesn't know that the mouse exists, but is subconsciously directed to chase it anyway. What a wretched, messy state of affairs. Oy. If and when the Unforgiven catch a member of the Fallen, assuming they don't just kill them, the responsibility for them passes over to individuals known as Interrogator Chaplains, a unique rank of chaplain inducted into the Inner Circle. Once the Fallen are back at the Rock, the chaplains have one goal: make the Fallen repent for their misdeeds and treachery. Yes, that was in air quotes, I'm staying neutral on this one. Almost all of them fail, and only a very few skilled interrogators can even get a single success in their careers. Even Asmodai, the most feared of the interrogator chaplains and the overall master of the group, only has a couple of black pearls on his Rosarius as a mark of his success. Either way, the Fallen are killed whether they repent or not, so showing remorse and wishing to atone is all well and good, but even then, getting captured is a big no-no. Now, let's take a look at a few of the famous fallen angels. I've discussed some of these tales in my Legion's log on the Dark Angels, so I'll likely end up skipping on some heresy-era details to avoid repeating myself. I wish to not start with Luther directly, since we've told most of his story earlier, but rather with one of those fallen who remained under the sway of the Chaos Gods, Marvis. This guy ended up on the Unforgiven's radar in M36, having been found in control of a Chaos Warband of some sort, but they were unable to either engage or capture him, or he's always stayed a step ahead of them in some way. However, his infamy comes less from his betrayal of the Dark Angels, but for more what he's become in the modern era. Marvis is, to our knowledge, the only fallen to have become a demon prince, and he uses his new form to mock his former legion with Dark Angels-esque armor and a head styled on a Calibanite lion, a beast so powerful that only Lionel Johnson and Zahariel, the individual believed to be the fallen known as Cypher, have ever actually killed one. Though even this mockery and blatant exposing of the Fallen is naught on the most recent deed of Marvis against the Dark Angels, as he was the one responsible for the hushed up but shocking raid on the Rock itself by a demonic army. The former First Legion were battered in this invasion, which took place not long after the formation of the Great Rift, and either during or just after the end of the Noctis Aeterna by the Rock's own measurement. Marvis himself almost managed to kill Ravenwing Grandmaster Samael, but he was driven back by Deathwing Master Belial, who may have stood a chance at slaying the Demon Prince in turn. He never had the chance though, as Marvis and his army retreated into the Immaterium soon after, seemingly for no reason. But there was a reason, one known only to Supreme Grandmaster Azrael. Luther, the arch-traitor who had survived the destruction of Caliban and been held prisoner in the heart of the Rock for millennia, was gone, freed in the chaos of the raid. Now, this is obviously a bad thing in the mind of the Unforgiven, but there's an interesting paradox behind what's happened in the beforehand and what happened next. Rumours have been growing of a Legion of Fallen mustering somewhere, with Azrael suspecting, perhaps obviously, that Luther is its leader now that he... However, Luther has spent the last 10 millennia ranting and raving to Supreme Grandmaster after Supreme Grandmaster about how the Lion will forgive him when he returns. Spoiler, he's sleeping in the Rock somewhere, taken by the Watchers in the dark, in case you didn't know. Now, Luther could be lying to save his own skin, but 10,000 years of unflinchingly sticking to one story and coming across as insane into the bargain is an exceptional bit of acting if he's been able to do it. And if he isn't lying, then who's really in charge of this supposed Fallen Legion? My guess is Marvis, since Cypher seems to play both sides all the time, almost on a whim. And for the record, yes, Cypher will get his own log in future. There's a lot to unpack there, and I can't cram it in here. One individual I did mention in the past was Mere Astalan, usually just known as Astalan, and his testimony is one of very few full perspectives given from a member of the Fallen. Astalan was one of the first 5,000 Astartes ever created by the Emperor on Terra, even before the Legions were a thing, and he became a chapter master in the First Legion either before or after the rediscovery of Lionel Johnson. Sources seem to conflict, and I don't know why. However, he was censured much later in the Great Crusade after a conflict with another chapter commander known as Belath regarding the approach taken in the compliance of the world of Byzanthus. Whilst it cannot be confirmed that this was the exact cause, Astalan's diplomatic approach was reported as cowardly by Belath, and he was sent back to Caliban around 15 years after Luther's own banishment. Despite the confusion of those who'd been sent back with Luther why someone else had been censured much later, Luther embraced and won over Astalan quickly. When trouble arose on Caliban and the Astartes were forced to intervene, Astalan was one of the first to step forward with the battle cry for Luther. Not for the Emperor, not for the Lion, not for anything, for Luther. He was given command of the planetary defences soon after, and when Luther formally announced to the Calibanite commanders that he no longer had any faith in the Lion, effectively announcing his secession and the creation of the Fallen, Astalan followed him in this and, eventually, complied with the order to arrest the Imperial authorities on Caliban. Mind you, he appeared to join an anti-Luther conspiracy in order to restore the original pre-Lion Legion that he knew until things could be properly reassessed. This did turn out to be a ruse though, as he double-crossed the conspirators at the last minute to aid Luther, stating that he wanted the Lion gone and was happier working for someone who shared that worldview. Though Luther was suspicious and did note Astalan's disdain for all things Calibanite, he did seem to kind of go with it. All that aside, Astalan is the one credited, by himself in his own testimony, as the one to fire upon the Lion's fleet when it returned to Caliban, deciding to do so as his means of advising Luther on the course of action when the fleet came back. He was scattered like the rest of the Fallen, but despite being warned by others about what the Dark Angels had become post-heresy, he chose to surrender to them when they hunted him down, and then instantly regretted it when he saw for himself just what the Unforgiven were. He was interrogated and provided his version of events for the Horus Heresy and the fall of Caliban. He claimed that Luther and co were still Imperial loyalists, unsure of the alignment of Lion at that time due to being stuck on Caliban, with their loyalty to the Emperor being their highest priority. His reason for firing on the Dark Angels in orbit were twofold. He assumed that the pro-Lion contingent of Astartes on Caliban had been talking to taint their Primarch's view, and he still had no idea on which side of the heresy the Lion had fallen, which is backed up by the fact that the Knights Errant couldn't glean any information during their own infiltration of Caliban. He then admitted openly that he wanted Lion dead, with his loyalty to the Emperor coming first, and then he went as far as to accuse the Primarch of awaiting the end of the Siege of Terror and turning up late in order to see who won, implying he would jump to Horus's and Chaos's side if it so happened to suit him. He was locked in the Rock, but who has since escaped and remains at large, having been involved with the traitor forces that tried to use Tactica in the aforementioned causal loop incident. Not exactly helping your Emperor loyalist image there, Astalan, got to admit, but what do I know? Finally, let's touch on a more recent incident involving the Fallen, something that took place in perhaps the most critical war zone of M42 up to now, Vigilus and the Narkmund Gauntlet. This concerns the Fallen librarian known as Osandus, an individual in the service of War Master of Chaos Abaddon the Despoiler, who had been bailed out from the Pandorax campaign and later travelled to Vigilus itself, hiding out in a place called the Citadel Vigilant and the leader of a small group of Fallen. After a long time, they were able to harness a device known as the Void Claw found atop the Citadel, a weapon that created intense gravitic nonsense. I might be good at physics, but grav guns are not my area of expertise, so I have no clue how this thing works, don't ask. The original plan was to use this weapon to destroy nothing short of the Rock itself, luring the Unforgiven to Vigilus by creating a small army of Fallen. But Abaddon had bigger and grander plans. The War Master sought to use the Void Claw to actually destroy the Narkmund Gauntlet itself, which, lest we forget, is the only known stable route across the Cicatrix Maledictum. But the firing of the weapon exposed the Citadel Vigilant, which had been hidden in a massive storm due to the gravity effects. The Dark Angels already had a presence in the war zone and suspicions of a Fallen presence there, perhaps obviously given the original plan for the Void Claw, and they were able to capture or kill Osandus as well as deactivate the weapon, whilst the wider war for Vigilus was settled between Abaddon and Marneus Calgar. And there you have it, at least a measure of insight into the Fallen Angels. I know, we didn't tell every tale, some have been given elsewhere in the past or maybe filled out in the future. There's just a lot going on with some of them. How you interpret the Fallen Angels and Luther is entirely up to you. I've tried to tell their story as objectively as possible, let you make up your own mind, but we may never know exactly what the true events were for the fall of Caliban, the scattering of the Fallen, the supposed corruption of Luther, and everything else. We may never know. Either way, the Fallen are the skeleton in the closet of the Dark Angels, the shadow of their past that refuses to let itself be forgotten. And if events pan out a certain way, that shadow may step out into the light much more clearly soon. Now, this was the 149th log for 40k Stories. I know, crazy, right? So, we have a special old log to do next time, and whilst I hope to have it for you soon, I want to make sure I get it right. It is a long tale to tell, and I want to do it justice. For now though, thank you for watching Tactica Imperialis, and I'll see you all again. Goodbye.